So I forgot to start recording at the beginning of this, so there's a little bit that I've already done. And even with that, this video was over 3 hours long. The other two that were released recently, the one with Nicola and the one with Retsko, were each just over an hour, maybe not even that long. So what's going on here is basically I took a lot of the mistakes and a lot of the things that I just really didn't like about those last two, and I decided to try something a little bit different. And you'll notice that my setup on my desk is also a little bit different. So what I was doing previously is something that I have seen a lot of other watercolor painters do, which is to shade through increasing your saturation of the color. So I would take the same orange for Retsko and just keep layering that orange again and again and again until it got darker. And doing it that way always kind of really seemed to break my brain, and it wasn't working. Especially since with every other method that I use for coloring, whether that's acrylic paints, digital markers, I shade through value painting, where I darken the value rather than increase the saturation. So I wanted to try that. So that's what I was doing here. And I was also trying to be a little bit more mindful of the colors that I was using to begin with. So I've got a blotter sheet over on the left, which is what that is. I'm just taking the colors that I'm mixing and I'm making sure that they are accurate. I'm still having to do a few different layers to get the colors to dry properly, because they're always a little bit darker when they're wet, and once it dries it lightens up a little bit. So I did a few different layers, and in a few areas I put down the wrong color, so I had to do even more layering, which wound up working out really well, because it means that the colors are a lot more consistent, they're a lot more muted. This is a character that has very dusty, desaturated tones. So I wanted to make sure that I got those as accurate as possible. And it's always really difficult when I've got characters that started out purely digital and trying to make that translate over to traditional media. Because when I first started out, obviously it was long enough ago where all of my characters were traditional media first, and then translating them over to digital was a lot more easy because I could just kind of color pick from my pages and figure out what worked there. So doing it the other way, where I design the colors digitally and then try to put them down on traditional media, kind of creates some issues because it's hard to match those colors, and you can't really go too far backwards once you've oversaturated or made a color too dark. So you'll notice that I'm doing a lot of layering, going back and forth between one and the other. And one of the things that I still wasn't quite sure how I wanted to do was the fluff in her ears, because she has a lot of really kind of light, fluffy hairs that are kind of coming off of the edge, and I wasn't really sure how to get that across in watercolor, and I don't think I really figured it out. It's something that if I were doing acrylics, I probably would have dry brushed that part, but I'm not sure really how to do that sort of a technique with watercolor, because it's a very wet medium. You can make acrylics very, very dry. So what I wound up doing with her hair here is I was kind of doing some of the things that I didn't like that I'd done with Retsko and with Nicola, where I'm using the saturation to kind of create different tones in her hair. So I'm not really shading her hair at this point, but I'm making it look like it's got different colors and different tones, and separating out the different locks just using that without really doing any shading. And as that dries, I'll kind of go back and forth and add a little bit more, trying to figure out how to build up on that. But I haven't really done any of the shading yet, because one of the things that I really struggled with Retzko and with Nicola and with any of the others that I might have done before with watercolor, I'm not sure, was trying to break those different colors down into individual blocks and see the different parts of the character, not as a whole and not as a single object or a single shape, and try to break that down and keep it consistent. That's something I found really difficult. So instead, what I wound up doing is doing what I would normally do if this were digital or if it were markers, and I found colors that I wanted to use for the shading, and mainly it's just kind of, I think it's a desaturated, very, very light brown, kind of like a grayish, very gray light brown that I was just using to layer over and over again. And that way I could see the entire thing as one single form and not, okay, her cheek is this shape and then her muzzle is that shape and the top of her muzzle is this other shape and her ear is 3 different shapes, which really doesn't work. And if you saw me attempt this portrait with the acrylics, that was kind of what I was trying to do. The problem is the stuff that I used for my wash wound up not being acrylic. It did turn out to be a mislabeled gouache, and gouache does not behave like acrylics. It does not behave like watercolors. It's its own very unique thing, and it did not want to mix very well with either of them. And there's another one fairly recently, I think, that you might be seeing in the future that I kind of screwed up again, trying to use gouache along with the watercolor, and it just does not work. The gouache needs to be its own thing. It needs to not be used in tandem with anything else because it just doesn't play very well with others. But here we go. I've got this really, really light wash. It has hardly any pigment in it. And as it dries, it will dry even lighter. And I'm able to just lay down that color. And I don't have to worry about every single part of her being a different shape. I can focus on the entire form and put the shadow down as a single unit. And that makes it so much easier. And it makes it so much more cohesive. She isn't broken up and she doesn't have these weird errors that the other two really had. And that's something that I have actually been weirdly struggling with lately, is just keeping my forms consistent. I'm not sure why. I mean, I'm pretty sure the reason why is that I have not been doing art seriously for a very long time. So I'm just kind of having to relearn a lot, and I've forgotten a lot of the shortcuts that I used to take. But you can really start to see that shadow build up without having to worry about being 800 different things. Also, at this point, I hadn't realized that my Copic multi-liners are pretty much completely waterproof. My Micron ones are not, and I think that might be why I didn't realize that the Copic ones aren't, because I've always known that Micron multi-liners will smudge and will smear, and I can't use them with markers at all, because as soon as I put a marker down on it, it just kind of becomes a mess. Which is a shame, because they're supposed to be one of the better brands, but they're the one I like the least. So I've been doing a lot of these watercolor pieces and a lot of marker pieces without putting my lines down first. And I didn't realize until fairly recently that I can do that. And I can make things a lot more easy on myself, because with this one, you can already kind of see that a lot of the little lines that I've used for the detailing have all kind of disappeared, and they're not really there anymore. So when I come back later and do the line art, it turns into this weird guessing game. And then another thing that I was trying to do here, which meant that I needed to mix a very opaque wash, is I'm trying to put what would normally be a luminosity layer, if this were digital, to get this shine from the street lamp on her edges, trying to get like this really hard shine on her. And it kind of worked. I think if it had been a little bit more opaque, or if I had done a few more layers, it might have worked a little bit better. But at this point, I had been working on it for a very long time. I was pretty ready to be done. I might have even live streamed this. I'm not sure. It's hard to remember what I've streamed and what I just sat down watching garbage TV while I was working on it with. But I wanted to try to recapture the mood and the atmosphere that I had originally tried to go with the acrylic version of this. I wanted her to be in this kind of really dark area, because the scene that this takes place in, they're up on what is called a mountain. It's this huge hill in the middle of Portland covered in woods. It's a big park. They call it Mount Tabor. It's really not much of a mountain, especially when we've got Hood right there, which is a real mountain. But I kind of wanted to use a lot of dark purples and blues to kind of imply that she was surrounded by trees. And then we've got the yellow from the street lamp up ahead of her, or up above her. And what I didn't do, because I wasn't really sure if I trusted it, I've been having some issues with it. I've got masking fluid. I should have used it, because then I could have got these darker little splotches right up against her a lot more comfortably. I didn't want it to smear into her, and I just didn't trust the masking fluid on something like this. I really do need to start playing with it more and getting more comfortable with it. And then once it dried, I decided to go ahead and just start doing the outlining. I'm using my multi-liners. I think I might have used the brush pen on this. I think I mentioned that I've been getting more comfortable with it, and I figured out that what it needs is not necessarily small details. It does work really well for details, but it works best for large subjects. So these big portraits wind up working really well for it. I've got this kind of not really an inconsistent line weight, but it's not completely flat and rigid like some of the other line art styles that I do. That said, I do still think I like using the other multi-liners, the ones that are just the bullet nibs, and doing different line weights that way. But these portraits especially turned out really well when I started really getting the hang of this brush. And it's something that's always kind of intimidated me. I've never really been able to figure out how or why it works until fairly recently. So what I wound up doing was using the medium-sized brush, I think, for her main outlines, and then I used one of the very, very small, maybe like the 0.3 or 0.03. I don't know. I don't know the numbers on them. One of the very tiny bullet nib ones, one of the really small fine liners, to do the outlines on her color. And that's another thing I've always struggled on, whether or not I like, is outlining the color. But I think when I use the really fine ones, it does look really nice. But here's Penny, and she looks so much better than the time I tried to do her in acrylic. I kind of want to do a lot more of these, and we'll probably do that in the future. I've got a bunch of stuff coming up, though, a lot of commissions, so you'll be seeing less of my own characters and more of that, I think, going forward. But if you want to see anything, let me know, and I'll try to get to it.